Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We all know in this place that Canada is facing a housing crisis, and that looks different for different people. For some seniors now, it means pitching a tent in the community park that used to be the place they would go for recreation. For some families, it means cutting back on food in order to make rent. And we know that we got to here because we had decades of Liberal and Conservative governments who did not invest in non-market housing for a very long time. And now we're trying to address this crisis. But I think the most important number for Canadians to bear in mind in terms of the success or failure of the National Housing Strategy is Steve Pomeroy's number, who says that for every 1 unit of affordable housing that we build in Canada today, we are losing 15. And that should give everyone, I think, a very clear picture of how inadequate the federal government's efforts so far have been in addressing the housing crisis. Now, in the fall economic statement, the government announced a replenishment of some funds, like the Rental Construction Financing Initiative and the Co-Investment Fund, but they put that off for another 2 years. That money's not even going to begin to flow until 2025, which means that the construction of those units is even further down the road when Canada is currently experiencing a housing crisis. So my question is very simple. Instead of regaling me with things that have been built under the National Housing Strategy, there are some, but as I say, they are decisively inadequate. I want to hear a simple answer as to whether or not that money that's been announced for these programs that already exist will be moved up from 2025 to 2023.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the opportunity. And I do agree with the honourable colleague on a few things. I do agree that the lack of investment on the part of previous governments, Liberal and Conservative, have taken us to this point where Canada does have a genuine housing crisis in front of it. We have to recognize that first and foremost. I also would say, though, that the housing crisis and the lack of affordability that we find is ultimately underpinned by a supply crisis. We need to build more. And I know that he cites numbers from Mr. Pomeroy and others. I've heard his citations in committee given. That's all well and good, Madam Chair. But the key point is that when you build more, you add to supply. You add to supply, you bring down costs. That's true for renters. That's true for prospective homeowners. I will point to the fact that in just the past few months, this government has waived GST from the construction of apartments. It's also introduced funding through the Housing Accelerator Fund, a $4 billion fund, Madam Chair, that is going to result in the next 4 years in 45,000 additional homes and 200,000 homes over the next decade. Add to that homes that have already been constructed or led to the housing, I should say, of individuals who have found themselves on the street, unfortunately. 200,000 people who were either homeless or very close to being homeless have found themselves housed, quite often with wraparound supports that I know the member who has raised this question appreciates. This has involved collaboration with not-for-profits as well. Now he points to the fall economic statement. I think there's something quite substantive there. As far as when funding will be allocated, those decisions will be made. What we're looking at, though, is more funding for non-market housing, dealing with short-term rentals. These are not small things, Madam Chair. These are meaningful movements forward. And it contrasts, I think, quite strongly with the Conservative Party's approach. They've put forward a private members' bill through their leader that would lead to less homes. We heard that from the Department of Finance through an analysis. They want to tax home builders, and they want to cut funding for the Housing Accelerator Fund. That is not going to lead to any meaningful movement towards greater supply. In other words, it's not going to address the affordability issue that Canadians face, whether it's to rent, to buy a home. It's also not going to do anything for people that unfortunately still find themselves homeless. That's something that we all have to collaborate on. The National Housing Strategy is there. Half the funding, and I remind my colleague of this, half the funding in the $80 billion National Housing Strategy is still in place, and it's been supported, it's been supplemented now in the fall economic statement. So I think these are important points to keep in mind, Madam Chair. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would remind my colleague that some of that funding is in abeyance because it's been accorded to projects that can't move ahead because interest rates have gone up. It's why New Democrats have been advocating so hard to ensure that the GST rebate also applies to nonprofit projects that had federal government financing and had stalled out because of rising interest rates, regardless of when they began construction, because that's part of making good on the commitments the government has already made, and we can't seem to get a positive answer in respect of that extension of the GST rebate. We do hear a finance minister who will brag that Canada is doing the best among the G7 or the OECD, depending on the day, in terms of its deficit, in terms of its debt, in terms of its credit rating. And we've heard from the Governor of the Bank of Canada that spending on housing supply wouldn't be considered inflationary. There's no better time to invest, and there's no more urgent time to invest. Why is it that we continue to see the government, when it announces new funds, backload that funding several budget years down the road?
Parliamentary Secretary.
I remind my colleague, and he knows this very well, that funding has been allocated and we're seeing results in his own province, in his own community. I point to funding that was announced, $13 million for 78 homes for Indigenous peoples throughout Manitoba. That came through the Rapid Housing Initiative. In June of 2023, $12 million for 57 units. This goes to Indigenous peoples, youth who have experienced homelessness, along with women and their children who have lived through domestic violence. That will go to individuals in Winnipeg. Quite recently, in fact, in November of 2023, through the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, that has been mentioned, $132 million for 447 apartments. Those are that's a low-interest loan, Madam Chair, that goes to developers that put up purpose-built rentals. Again, this is just for one city and one province. More can be done, of course, and more should be done. But I think that the results of the National Housing Strategy need to be emphasized. They're not nothing. They're very serious, and we continue.
And we are done.